if you wanted to give first sort of generic advice to journalists trying to be solutions-based journalists, evidence-based journalists, what might that be? Let's start there.
Treat it the way you would other stories. Again, it's always a huge benefit if this is an area where you're specializing in, but if you're a general beat reporter and you get thrown into a story like this, treat it the way you would other stories. Report on the facts, but also as much as you're able to within obviously the bounds of your deadlines and things of that nature, try to reach out to other people, other organizations for opinions. Expert opinions on what may have transpired or what's behind it. And I think you need to, look at doing this. There are lots of organizations out there that you can reach very quickly that are in the field of mental health and deal with mental illness. And it's as quick as a call to you, for example, as quick as a call to somebody else at a university, at a hospital, to a well-known or respected source on the subject. And again, wait till the facts become available. Oftentimes these stories will have quite a long life. And it's better, again, not to create false impressions or provide false information, that not only is misleading, but quite harmful, when you consider, the barrier that stigma poses to people seeking help. If anything, what it does is it perpetuates those stereotypes, those misconceptions, so that those individuals, in fact, are more likely to do more harm to themselves because they're not seeking help.
And how can reporters effectively reflect on what their own stigmatizing preconceptions might be?
Yeah, that's where I think you've got to do a lot of self-reflection in terms of what are your own personal biases. And I think you need to park those at the door. You really do. I mean, it's if you're reporting on anything, it's human nature to have biases when you're reporting on things. But as much as possible, good journalists, recognize those and park them and try to report accurately, objectively, fairly on the issue that they're dealing with, and as much as possible, try to seek information from those authoritative sources rather than assuming that just because somebody gives you an opinion, that opinion is factual. And again, as I said, police officers are not psychiatrists and psychologists. Judges are not psychiatrists and psychologists, much as psychiatrists and psychologists are not police officers. So if you want to talk about the evidence and the crime and what occurred, fine. But I think you have to, again, look at approaching it from the perspective that get expert opinion, be evidence-based in dealing with those stories. And I think you'd be surprised. I think if you go back and you take a look at the history, and there's lots of great material out there right now. And that's the big change that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years, that the subject is being studied much more. I think that people are understanding that mental illness and mental health problems are far more common than we believed in the past. And people often jump to the conclusion that mental illness is associated with violence and danger, when that's not the case. That's far more the exception than what is real. And those are some of the kind of things that you have to take into account when you're looking at those kind of situations.
Thank you. Are there any particular techniques that you found useful in helping journalists to illuminate what some of those biases might be for themselves?
That's a very good question. Aside from self-reflection, but taking a look at some of the guides that are out there. I know Associated Press has a series of guidelines to help reporters what to consider when doing reporting on the subject. I know that the commission, as I said, has worked with the CBC and another organization, and I'm really pleased to say that the guidelines that were produced by the Canadian Forum on Violence and Trauma are being used in many of the major media organizations within Canada. The guide is available online. They're using it in journalism schools as well. So I think things are changing, and we are recognizing that it's much more common, mental illness and mental health, from an illness perspective, and not necessarily on the violence and dangerous side that people often sort of think are associated with those things. And again, it's all about the stigma. And I think if there's anything that we can do, what journalists can do is draw attention to the stories that aren't covered. I mean, where are the policies, that, and the services? I mean, the lack of services for young people, for the population in general, when it comes to mental health compared to physical health. And yet again, when we begin to look at the connection between the two, where mental health, poor mental health can lead to serious physical problems, heart attacks, for example, and other things of that nature if somebody's under too much stress. I think the stories that can be done around why are there so fewer beds allocated, considering how common mental illness is and the services that are needed. Why are there far fewer psychiatrists? Why do people have such long wait times in terms of getting treatment and access to service? I mean, these are all stories, waiting to be done, and the spotlight put on them for good journalism.
I think last question, any particular thoughts for journalists in the Caribbean who will be the first audience for this training?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's following the best principles and practice of good journalism, not letting cultural biases or misconceptions influence your reporting or your coverage of the story. And again, I think it boils down to being really objective and thoughtful, and reporting on the facts. And as the facts unfold, mental illness may have played a role in the story, but again, I think you need to contextualize it by saying, this is an unusual situation. It's not common. And again, as I said, one of the things that we found in that one report by one of the Calgary newspapers reporting on that murder-suicide was how balanced and how thoughtful it was, but it was a very large piece. But I think you could also work that into smaller pieces. I think there are key messages or elements or components that can go in that really help destigmatize the article, and also the use of language. Language can be quite offensive to those people living with a particular disorder. Oftentimes people will call somebody, here's a classic, somebody's bipolar. That doesn't mean they have a split personality. That whole concept of split personality doesn't really have anything to do with bipolar disorder, as an example. The use of the term schizophrenic, that's highly offensive to somebody who has a mental illness. The use of the term crazy, even in common usage or common language. Again, if you're a person who is living with a mental illness, you would find that quite offensive. And it's a matter of, we have changed so much in the way of language when you take a look at over the course of even the last couple of decades, when it comes to sexism, when it comes to gender, when it comes to all of these kind of things. And yet we seem to lack that sensitivity when it comes to mental health and mental illness.
I would think particularly in the Caribbean, where there is such an abundance of very distinct cultures, both within these individual countries, small countries, and having to be sensitive to all of those perspectives might, I would think, pose a particular challenge in the Caribbean.
Culture and religion really pose a big challenge, and beliefs. We know, for example, in some Asian cultures, there is no word for mental illness, and it's going to be a real challenge. But again, I think you have to look at it in a scientific and objective way, and park those personal beliefs or cultural beliefs at the door as you're doing the story. I think, again, it is about reporting the facts. It is providing some context, but that context has to be provided from expert sources, not assumptions, as I was basically indicating before. And, get to the heart of it, and also be careful about the language you're using. Um, if you were doing other stories, you would also be cautious of how you refer to people of, different gender, different culture, different sex. And you have to almost take the same approach when you're doing it about mental illness. You can't say this person was a schizophrenic. You can't say, they're crazy and that's why they did this. I mean, again, we're trying to be a lot more sensitive, and the benefits of that are more people willing to come forward and seek help, and not putting them in a position where they feel discriminated against and they're hiding, and they're not going to get better. That's one of the big problems, is that we see oftentimes people will wait many years, depending on the type of disorder that they've got, before they will seek help. I know with depressive disorders, people can wait up to 6 years or more before they go and seek professional help. When it comes to anxiety disorders, we've seen studies which show that people will wait upwards of 23 years before seeking help. Now, just imagine what takes place during the course of that time, because somebody hasn't gotten the necessary help or support that they need. I know one of the examples I use is that if I was to step off a curb and twist my ankle or break my ankle, I'd be to my doctor right away. I could think of all sorts of ways that I could rationalize why I shouldn't go and talk to my doctor if I was beginning to exhibit the symptoms of depression or anxiety or other mental illnesses, because I might be concerned about how other people were looking at me, or how they were treating me, or how I might be treated. And so again, what we're trying to do is break that down and get people to recognize that mental illness is every bit as serious as physical illness and deserves to be treated as such. And we should be doing everything we can to encourage people to get the help they need. But also, I think it's important for journalists as well to really begin to look at, why aren't the services available to help these people? Because again, it's a dilemma that we face. So we encourage people to go and get help. But if they can't get service, are we really doing our job? So, there's always that balancing act.
Thank you so much. This, I think, will be very motivating to reporters. I certainly hope so.
Yeah.
Certainly critical issues, Michael. Anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so. At this point, I'm just sort of looking at some notes that I made to myself. Again, as I said, it's oftentimes when horrible incidents occur, it's because somebody's off their medication. There's usually a reason behind why something happens, and again, it's important to delve into that and see what was the cause, rather than just leaving it to people to use their imagination to determine, just because you've labeled it as one thing, and people really don't have a better understanding about why that happened or what was the cause. And again, I would just sort of really encourage people to, if they're covering the story, to talk to experts as much as possible, but also not to leave out people with lived experience of mental illness. We do a lot of training, and one of the things that we find is really, really effective is that when people hear the stories of those individuals who lived through a serious mental illness, the stigma they experienced, but what was the catalyst that got them to seek help? And once they got the help, how did it change their lives? And then to see them as excellent examples of people who have gone on to lead very full and productive lives. I know, there have been a number of, high profile people that have come forward and talked about the fact that, they lived with a mental illness and were able to overcome it. And when you look at the number of famous people out there, Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, the list goes on and on and on about people. They had a mental illness, and yet these are some of the people that we look up to, and really had a major influence on society. And yet they had a mental illness. That doesn't mean it's associated with a lot of the negative stereotypes that are often associated with mental illness, wrongly so.
What I'm hearing from you is that in terms of what journalists might take away from this, that even here in particular, when dealing with mental health and mental illness issues, that simply by avoiding inaccuracies, by avoiding stigmatizing language, that you can create an environment that makes it easier for someone to not self-blame or not fear that others might disparage them. That if you report accurately and responsibly here, that it really allows people to get the help they need without being frightened of doing so.
Absolutely. And one of the other cultural changes that, we would like to see take place is creating an environment where people who may not have a mental illness or experiencing mental health problems are supportive of those individuals who are, and are able to direct them to the services and resources that they might need. And recognizing that early, in the early stages, can make such a huge difference to a person's life. One of the other things that we found, which is quite interesting, and the research holds this up, is that in the vast majority of cases, about 70% of the cases, the onset of mental illness, when it does occur, begins to manifest itself in the adolescent years. So just think of the difference we can make if we get rid of the stereotypes and misconceptions around mental illness, getting young people to come forward and seek help earlier on. It's like anything. The sooner an intervention takes place to help a person, the sooner the person is going to get better. By delaying that treatment, by delaying getting those services, only complicates it. So again, if I was to wait, 6 years before I got my broken ankle treated, the outcomes would be quite different, as opposed to, as soon as I recognized that I was beginning to exhibit some of the signs and symptoms that might indicate that I'm, having a problem. So whatever we can do to foster and promote that early recognition and early help seeking is very, very important.
Wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much. Great.
Thanks very
Thank you,
much.
Michael.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.